Welcome to What Is It About the Weather? I'm your host, Mark Jelonic, and this is the weekly podcast where we explore the many ways in which weather influences our everyday lives. This week, we're going to be talking about, do we really get too much weather information or weather forecast? But we're also going to do a bit of eclipse discussion since I've been asked to do that. You know, it's funny. A few weeks back, I think I recorded an intro that I really liked. And now I'm thinking to myself, I need to go back and either make it a permanent clip or re-remember what it was that I said because it just sounded right. You know, it only took, 60 some odd episodes to get there. But I think it was an intro that maybe I'll remember what the verbiage is at some point and use it again and again. Now, before I get too deep into anything this week, it's important. Any of you people who use the AccuWeather app on your device, and I'm not sure if this is an iOS or an iOS and an Android thing, make sure you download the latest version. Now, you guys know that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of AccuWeather because they do these extended long-range forecasts that I'm opposed to, and it does paint a picture of a company that, makes me not want to maybe use their other products, even if they are good on the short range, but I know a lot of people do. A lot of people trust the AccuWeather product, and that's fine. But a security expert found that the app has been tracking you even if you opted out. So whatever you do, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a Washington Post article that came across my Twitter feed. And again, this is something that I wouldn't normally see because not using their product, wouldn't get any update or anything. Just make sure you do. Make sure whatever you do, stop right now. If you use the AccuWeather app, make sure you have the latest version, whatever you do. Or temporarily uninstall it until, you have time to download the new version. Just don't want you guys being tracked without you being aware. Now, some people may say, what's the big deal? Well, I'm not sure how big it is. But, when you opt out and people are still tracking it, I don't know. I'm not a real big fan of that. All right, enough about your emergency alert from the What Is It About the Weather alert forecasting system. Let's talk a little bit about, I don't know, what happened in your weather intertwined week. For me, class stuff, right? So here I am, new semester. I really, a month ago, if you'd asked me, I wasn't going to be teaching this semester, but here I am teaching, and I'm teaching radar and satellite meteorology. Good group of students. Oh, but it's so early. It's so early. It's 8 a.m. is when the class starts, and I remember in college when my freshman year, and I thought to myself, yeah, I'm going to get up early. I'm going to do this 7:50 a.m. class was the first one on my campus. Now, let's keep in mind that I opted for this by choice. This was my choice. It wasn't something I was stuck with. Although when you're a freshman in a lot of colleges, you don't always get the best choices. But I was in the honors program, so I got to register early. So I even had an option to not get stuck in this 750 course, and I took it. And I tell you what, especially if it's in a location where you live on campus, or maybe even if you're traveling to campus, and that's the situation I have, is a lot of my students are actually driving in every morning. And so they've got to deal with rush hour, and it was the same thing. I mean, I was up and getting on the MARTA train at 6:30, and again, that's not that big deal. That's not that early for people that are used to commuting. But, I've got to be on at 8 a.m. I've got to be able to say, the students don't have to be on. I've got to be on. I've got to sound intelligent. Now, the benefit I have is it's 8 a.m., so maybe they're not as quick to catch on something that I've said incorrectly, but I did notice that I was having word problems at between 8 and 9 a.m. in the morning. In any case, again, good group of students, enjoying doing it. It's an interesting topic. So I'm teaching radar and satellite meteorology, and unlike last semester, this topic is a little more, I guess, natural to me, and I've used a lot of the material over the course of my professional career, so I can more quickly kind of digest maybe what I should be presenting in a lecture, whether it's scanning a book or paper, whatever it is, and pull out the highlights. A little easier for me, I guess, to prepare lectures and that sort of thing. Plus, it's also enjoyable. It's a lot more hands-on in some cases. So most people, most of you, when you get weather information, it's very common for you to see radar images or satellite pictures, but particularly like radar. Most people, everybody loves radar. If there's any question I get, and that's why I even did a show on this back in the video days on the best radar app, because people are really into that. People like that visualization. So most people are familiar with it. And so it's a lot more fun, I guess, to talk about than some of the heady scientific topics. But that's kind of been, I went from, I came in Sunday, arrived back from Santiago, and, oh man, no sleep on the flight. Oh, God, pilot, seriously, don't get on the intercom and tell everybody it's going to be a smooth flight. Now, keep in mind, this is an 8-hour plus flight. This depends on, this case I was flying to Miami first and then on to Atlanta, sometimes directly to Atlanta. But on average, let's just say it's 8 hours. Don't get on the intercom and tell people we're expecting a smooth flight the whole way. It just don't even do it. Why? Because at some point during that flight, there's going to be turbulence. And sure enough, it wasn't an hour in. And it was pretty meaningful turbulence. And as I discussed on my previous episode, I did pretty good with it for a while. It wasn't bothering me for a while. I was letting it do its thing. But I think there's that other point, and this hit me this week. If you've ever been in a turbulent, kind of stormy situation, when the plane all of a sudden, you hear that extra surge or whine in the engines as if the plane's having to work harder. And again, it gives you that impression that it's working harder to stay aloft. Now, as we discussed, there's a lot more to it than that, and that's not necessarily the case. But it was when one of those events happened that my body finally went, okay, this is driving me nuts. You can't ignore it any longer. But the funnier thing about it all was my wife is the one who usually says, on the flight down, I felt turbulence throughout the whole thing. And again, most of it wasn't major turbulence, but it kind of was just enough to keep me awake. We got down there and she's like, oh, I thought it was a smooth flight. Even on this one, she's like, no, that was a fair amount of turbulence. So I know I wasn't dreaming. And it did get better for the second half of the flight. But man, don't set me up for it's going to be a smooth flight. I have yet to have a smooth flight. There have been a couple that have been low on turbulence, but don't call it a smooth flight, especially when it's going to be happening that quickly into the process. Now, as you guys can hear, I'm still dealing with a little bit of this cold, so you'll have to forgive me at times if I get a little crackly or that sort of thing. I will try to pause or, mute things before I do any big coughing like I did just then, right? Now, because I've been asked and because people have speculated that I was going to be talking about the Eclipse, so I wasn't originally planning to do this. I had an episode planned. We are going to get into the energy sector, I promise. Or maybe this is some sort of clue that I'm not supposed to cover it. I don't think that's the case. It will be rescheduled. Don't worry. I will get around to it. But I don't want to shortchange it. And since we're going to talk about the eclipse for a while, I just thought that we would move that to a future date. And I will talk a little bit about this over weather forecast thing because it's more of a thinking piece. It's more of a question I have for you as much as anything else, or just some things that came to my mind as I was, oddly enough, looking at the coverage on the eclipse. All right. But let's just talk a little bit about my experience in general. So got back on the Sunday, from the turbulence, as I was saying. This is how I got sidetracked in this whole thing. So turbulence, Sunday, home, not much sleep. Finally, took a nap or whatever in the afternoon, got a little bit of sleep, but still just kind of keyed on jet lag. Got up Monday, and I was determined, as you guys know, to go try to see the eclipse. And in Atlanta, we have a few major arteries for those that aren't familiar, but anybody that lives in a big city, you tend to know you've got these big, roads that are the primary mechanism that people use to come into the city and go out of the city for daily commutes. Well, we had this reverse rush hour thing going on where everybody headed out of the city, or all the roads headed out of the city towards the eclipse areas, had these huge traffic jams. Now, this was on top of lots of people having already gone to the eclipse area. Now, there's a city in the state over called Greenville in South Carolina that was kind of in the eclipse zone. People there didn't even have to go anywhere. They were all set. But for all these people that live in and around Atlanta, we had to get out of the city if we wanted to see totality. A lot of people I know stayed behind and watched it and had a great viewing experience. But there were tons of folks like me who really wanted to go see this thing. And this wasn't just people in Atlanta, mind you. Atlanta has a huge airport, as many people who travel know. Atlanta's one of the busiest airports in the world. I know that, that kind of moniker goes around and comes around sort of thing. But just know a lot of people come and go. And a lot of people were flying into the Atlanta airport and then driving. Now they're joining me in this commute. So what I did, I went a little different route. And I happen to know a lot of the roads up where I was going to go because it's an area that I used to trout fish in when I was younger. And so spent a lot of time up in that region. And it's an area I also like to go to in the fall time of year here because they have a lot of, apple orchards or kind of fall event. We got a town up there called Helen, Georgia that does a big Oktoberfest celebration, that sort of thing. So all that was going on. All these little towns. So I looked at this traffic problem, and I was like, I'm going to go a different way. So I went up a road that's near me that kind of goes into North Georgia, but it doesn't go towards the Eclipse zone per se. But I knew if I went up that way, I'd deal with less traffic initially, and then I could kind of skirt to the east, which is what I needed to do. I essentially, instead of taking the hypotenuse of the triangle, if you will, I was taking the two other ends of the triangle. So I kind of went straight up to the north, and then I was going to head east. And all these little towns, they all were having these celebrations and everything else. And my plan generally worked. I mean, we got to where we were going. Yeah, there was still some traffic I had to deal with. But overall, I was driving around. We found this little town, and it was a little too crowded. And so we backed out of the town, and we found this little park, right? Just a little city park on a lake. And there were a few other people already there, but there were a couple picnic tables available. Pulled right in. Set up the tripod for taking pictures and, just started kind of interacting with people. And of course, right away, people, we were talking about the weather angle and that sort of thing. But overall, it was a very positive experience. First off, I got to spend a day with my wife, which is something I always enjoy doing, where we're not talking about business the whole time or that sort of thing or life. Sometimes when you get in a car, you go places. You get to talk about some other things. So that was really enjoyable. Here we had just come back from this long trip. So it was, it's just kind of a good frame to put around the eclipse viewing in general was just spending time with her. But met so many interesting people from all sorts of, like I said, the license plate, here we are, this little town in North Georgia, right? And I don't know what the population is, the vicinity, let's say it's 10,000 or less, though, fairly small. I could check that, but it's not going to happen in the course of this podcast. Little park. But here we are, little town, and the license plate's just in this parking lot. California, Michigan, Florida. So they were from all parts of the country. Some people had driven in. Some people, this was, they've recently come to the area and it was their car. But some, people coming from all over. And that was really neat too, right? That was a really neat aspect of it. But in any case, as I was going along, the interesting thing is none of these people, for the most part, brought cameras to take pictures with. People were being creative. They were taking those little paper eclipse glasses, and they created kind of a circular band, almost like a bracelet that they were sliding over their phones. But it was still, in some cases, giving them too much light coming in from around that thing. But so everybody was using my tape. But I did what I said I was going to do. I took my little point-and-shoot camera, and I taped a lens from one of these cameras, just cut it up and taped it right on top, and it gave me a nice solid coverage, and it worked just fine. So that was my high-tech solution. And so throughout, people, as here I was taking pictures of the tripod, everybody starts coming up and going, can you email me pictures and that sort of thing. So again, it was a great opportunity to kind of get to know who else was there, and all age brackets, all walks of life. It was kind of a neat reason for folks to be together that had nothing to do, that it wasn't stressful. It wasn't, divisive in any sort of way. It was just this neat event bringing people together to enjoy an experience. And I will tell you, it was incredible. It was an absolutely incredible experience because partly the whole experience, but as the eclipse was coming, anybody who's ever spent time outside kind of when the sun goes up, or particularly when it goes down at the end of the day and you get towards dusk, and you're going along and it's light, and then all of a sudden you notice this change and it's seemingly getting darker, but you may be able to still see who you're talking with, but you start to lose some of the depth, maybe things that you could normally see when it's light outside. But what was strange and different about it is because the light source in that case was from above, almost directly above, and not like when it's setting, and so it's in a specific direction, it was an eerie sort of sensation, right? Now, we did have some of those animal responses that people talk about changes in bird behavior or insect behavior, or this dog came running down the road. Now, I don't understand all these things. I'm not going to try to understand it today. So we did experience some of that. And yes, we did experience a weather change. Now, everybody was asking me these questions, and I was kind of talking to them as we were going along, right, about what changes to expect. And you guys know we did an episode about this, about what changes can you expect. And what I will tell you is from personal experience, my direct experience, the biggest thing was just the temperature change. And yes, it was noticeable, but part of that was it was a hot, sunny day in Atlanta, right? We were above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? So, if you want to do the math, that we were in that, we weren't quite to 35 C, but we were between the 30 and 35 C, so pretty warm, and it was humid, and so that drop in temperature, so the light change and the drop in temperature was very noticeable, but of course it only lasted for a short period of time. Now, in terms of wind and pressure, I've gone back and looked at the station. I was doing some local measurements, was something I was able to do that with. I didn't notice a huge pressure change, nor did I really expect to. And quite frankly, I didn't really notice any wind change, but I think part of that may have been that we were generally in a calm wind state to begin with. But overall, the benefit we had, and I was watching this as I was driving north because we had this chance of clouds, we had picture-perfect weather. There were some clouds in other locations that I could see in a distance, but where we were, no problems. So my gamble on going local turned to work out pretty well. Now, if you go to whatisitabouttheweather.com/eclipse, you can see the cover art will have one of my eclipse pictures. You can see pictures I took throughout, as well as a few composite shots. So if you want to experience a little bit more of the eclipse one last time, you can go there and get that information. All right. Long and short of it, it's a great experience. I know the U.S. has another one in about 7 years that's going to go through some heavily populated areas in the northeast of the U.S., as well as down through Texas. And so other people will get to experience the chaos. I don't know that I would go chasing it again. I liked the fact that it was something close to home to me. And I could see where people would get hooked on chasing these things. I don't know that it enticed me that much. The only way I guess it would be is if I were going to try to take maybe some better pictures or do something unique with it. Because the viewing was as much about, and I will tell you this, if you're going to look, while I don't know that, I didn't want to do any of these crowds. We didn't want to get into one of these big city things where they were having bands and they were having, big cooking festivals and that sort of thing. But sharing the experience with others and being able to chat with others about it, that made it, I think, more enjoyable. So, I do recommend that. And, overall, it was a pretty incredible experience with a weather twist. Partly because of the weather change and partly because people were asking me a lot of questions about eclipse and weather. So then, went straight into teaching mode the next day. And like I said, was up early a couple times this week, headed into campus and did that. Now, I didn't, at the beginning of this episode, I wanted to focus on the eclipse. But the other thing that's happened this week is I've been involved in a couple of other podcasts. One is related to me being interviewed about podcasting in general, and the other was just being on as a guest for somebody that, it was one of the hosts that interviewed me on their regular podcast. Now, I'm going to put in the show notes links to that. One is called the Undaunted podcast, and that's where I get interviewed, and the other is called Ritual Misery. But I want to give these guys their fair due, and I will introduce them kind of at the beginning of my weather intertwined week, because it really was. I mean, the whole point was to talk about what is it about the weather, but I want to give them kind of an intro, and since we were going kind of straight to the eclipse, I'm not going to get too deep in that, but you can check the show notes, and they'll get a full-on press release, I guess, if you will, next week, where I'll spend a little more time in the intro talking about that experience, and that way they're regular viewers and downloaders can get the episode, and then you guys can sneak in and get it behind and maybe help bump up their regular download numbers. All right. But I also wanted, like I said, so that it's just, again, my whole week's been that way. So here we are still talking about my week. So middle of the week, one of the episodes, again, that I recorded, it came out, and then I did this thing last night with them. And so it's kind of been nonstop about weather. Everything I've been doing has been kind of weather related. And I don't always have that. We've got this tropical cyclone going on in the U.S., and that's another thing, because I've got, whether it's people I know in the industry that work in this, or family members in the Texas area, particularly in Houston, they're going to be dealing with this incredible rain from what looks to be, and I think it's going to be, the first hurricane to hit the U.S. in years. You know, as active as some of the years have been, we've not had an actual hurricane make landfall, and it looks like it might actually be a major hurricane when it makes landfall. But it's a reminder that so much of the problems that come with these events aren't always the winds. All right, it can be. All right, winds can be damaging, but like with this storm, it's going to kind of stall out once it makes landfall and sit in the area for a few days. And it's just forecasted to dump massive amounts of rain in these areas. So for those of you down there, I hope everything goes well. I hope you're safe. And, you know, I've reached out to a few of them individually, and I still will reach out to a few more today. But, you know, just be safe down there. You know, be aware of the water situation probably more than the wind situation, unless you're, you know, right where it's making landfall, and certainly the wind will be a problem there as well. And the wind will, if it continues, will become a problem as the ground gets saturated. See, that's where it'll be an issue. Trees will get torn up because the ground will get saturated. It'll allow the root systems to kind of break away from the soil, and if there's enough wind, you know, things will get toppled over because of that. And that's a very common thing that happens once, you know, soils get a little bit too moist. All right, so here we are at the 20-minute plus mark, and we're going to get into what I call the little secondary story, and it's related to the eclipse. All right, and that's why we are going to talk about it briefly, because it really hit me as I've been watching other people kind of discuss how the eclipse has been covered. And as you know, for most local television stations, it meant the meteorologist got involved. And we've talked about this before. In a lot of places, the meteorologist kind of become the science person in general. All right, and it's something going on in the sky, so it gets related. But also, the Weather Channel was doing this huge thing, right? And I saw people making fun of the Weather Channel coverage, just in general, conversation. And that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Everybody has a right to make fun of things. There was some segment where there was just some weird music going on in the background. And I understood what they were getting at, and maybe if you didn't or you weren't trying to experience eclipse or being a little geeky about it, it felt a little odd for those people. And, you know, these are people that live in other parts of the country that maybe weren't experiencing the eclipse. And that includes some big cities, right, where that was happening. And so it seemed a little odd to them. But, you know, I could turn to them and say the same thing about whatever they're interested in. But it made me think about something. This whole idea of, do we really, are you as people, and for me, I can never get enough weather information, and I know that, right? I know that I love weather information. I like getting weather information. I like looking at radar and satellite imagery, right? But for the average consumer of weather information, not your weather geeks, your weather weenies, your weather nerds, whatever you want to call them, do we hit you with it too much? And I know some people, you know, we get off onto this about the cry wolf aspect, but it also makes me wonder, though, is something like the Weather Channel, just in its general state, a little bit of overkill? Now, certainly there's newsworthy items, right? When a Hurricane Harvey blowing through, there'll be a lot of coverage of that. Or when Katrina went through New Orleans and the humanitarian issues that came up. And it became a big news story, but that was less about the weather and more about the aftermath. The eclipse seemed to gets tied in this weather thing because it was a short-lasting event. You know, it came and went. And I think of weather in a lot of cases being like that. Yes, there are times when it becomes news events, right? But here's the way that I was looking at this, and I wonder, because I was listening to these people making fun, and do most people just think weather is just a piece of information? Yeah, they need a forecast. It's going to be a hot day, cold day, chance of rain. But does that mean, generally speaking, that weather And I'm dumping the eclipse into this, but weather is not newsworthy unless it becomes one of these crisis things where people die and that sort of thing. And the reason I was thinking about it that way is, news for most people are these extraordinary events, right? But think about commuting maybe. For the most part, people want to know if there's a commute thing going on, but outside of their commuting, they don't really pay attention to traffic information. Only if you're going somewhere. And for the most part, you don't get bombarded with that information. But what I know is whether it's on our apps or news or everything else, we do kind of constantly get fed weather information. You go to websites, like let's say you use Google News as your aggregator. You can't go to Google News without one of the primary things being the weather. And you may not care about the weather 24/7, but it's always kind of thrown at you. And it made me wonder if one of the problems that we face in the weather industry and how people perceive us is because they're constantly being bombarded by weather information, and sometimes not good weather information. If this gets into the perception of meteorologists aren't always right and that sort of thing, because this weather information's coming from every angle, right? Are we providing weather information overload? Is it too much? Should it be dialed back and only thrown at you when you specifically ask for it? If you go to a news site, for the most part, what you're interested in is current stories, what's new, what's hot, what's active. But almost any site you go to, whether it's a local television station, like I said, whether it's Google News or whatever it might be, one of the first things in some corner somewhere is going to be your weather, your local weather. And maybe really you just don't care at that moment about the weather. You don't want to see the weather. But every site you get thrown to, every link you go off into, so often, not always, but any of them that are like news sources, quite often have weather somewhere on it. So I am wondering if, the Weather Channel, as an example, maybe it's problematic in the sense that, or people are finding it more goofy because, the Weather Channel, in some ways, well, it's had an identity crisis a lot in the last few years when it got into reality TV too much, I think. But maybe there's this problem with, in some ways, it's just delivering basic weather information. And in some ways, it's getting into the news hype. There's going to be all this Harvey coverage, for instance. And for someone like me who's interested in that, I could tune into it. But let's say you just want your weather forecast, and I think this is where people have gotten. One of the challenges the Weather Channel has is, people just want 30 seconds of weather information. Okay, what's going on, whatever, let me get on with my day. And they don't want to digest the rest of this thing. So the Weather Channel then becomes, okay, when there's big news going on, that's fine. But they can't just turn the channel off the rest of the time. They've got to fill the airwaves the rest of the time. And I was looking at it even with this eclipse weather. And they had a story on it. And I can't remember, okay, we've got this problem now, whether it's weather.com or the Weather Channel. And I don't remember which of the two sites it was because they finally kind of started splitting off and going their own way. But there was a story about the changing weather with Eclipse, right? And I'll look it up actually while I'm sitting here so that I can properly say what it was. All right, so I think it's on the weather.com site, which is part of, again, it's now part of that whole IBM group. This is not specifically the Weather Channel. And the title of the story is as follows. 6 ways weather could change during the Great American Eclipse. All right. Now, I don't know what a great eclipse is anyways, but, again, a lot of news around that. And this is, like I said, consistent with the episode where we talked about the potential impacts of weather. And, it might be of interest to some people because there is talk about how does the weather change. So, fine. But near the very top of the article, kind of right after a little ad, so it is a little hidden. To be clear, this is a quote. Most of these weather changes will be small, perhaps imperceptible, unless you're closely watching weather instruments. Nonetheless, they will be of interest to meteorologists. Now that says that this article is not written for the general public. It's written for meteorologists. But of course, it's a very prominent article that came up that day because they're having to fill the time. But in short, what they're saying is there's this talk of all these weather changes, but there's a good chance you won't see or experience any of them. So I don't know. In the end, when I think about all this, the real question, and feel free to respond to me about this and your take. And again, I'm getting an audience here that I don't know. I think a lot of you have enough of an interest in weather that it wouldn't necessarily strike you that same way. But I do wonder, for the average Joe or Jane, do they get bombarded by too much weather information, which kind of makes them tainted towards when it does matter, or makes it comical that people would be, and again, I mean, even to some extent, I kind of found it comical because the eclipse was big news, and I understand why the Weather Channel did all the coverage they did, but is that where they should be? And what does it mean when the general public's sort of laughing at the Weather Channel? And again, my sample size is small, so maybe most people weren't laughing. But if they were, what does it mean when they're giving that sort of response and finding it kooky or weird or strange that the Weather Channel is doing that? And so maybe there is this disconnect. Maybe there's this disconnect, and that's why, for instance, the Weather Channel's had problem keeping viewers, because for the most part, people just want their 30 seconds of weather. And they can go so many places to get that now. They don't have to wait for weather on the 8s on the Weather Channel, right? I don't know. Just something that came to mind. And like I said, the focus here was more the eclipse today anyways. But ponder it. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Do we put too much weather information out in front of people? And that's what kind of maybe turns people against the weather forecasting process in general. All right. I'm going to wrap up here because my voice is starting to go. I'm still getting over this cold. Hopefully by next week I'll be fully over it. Although with teaching class, again, my voice has been a little more strained than it might be in a normal week. But we made it through. So let's wrap up. And like I said, a few links in the show notes. Those podcasts that I've been on, I'll give them a more proper introduction next week, but they will be in the show notes if you want to go listen. I will mention that the one I was interviewed on, Safe for Work. The one that is called Ritual Misery, not necessarily safe for work. I don't think the language was too harsh last night, but just in general, it's not something that you want to be playing on a speaker where other people can hear it. And I think that's about it. I've had some good episode suggestions, one from one of the guest hosts last night, Kent, another one from Kevin, who's been a listener for a while, where he wanted me to talk about the technology associated with weather forecasting. He works in a high-performance computing center at a university. And for those that don't know what that is, HPC is what it stands for, High Performance Computing. Of course, if I got the acronym right, which I think I did. But he had an interesting idea about covering the kind of the process from where the data comes from that drive the weather models all the way to the forecast that you do receive. All right. And I started thinking about that, and that's probably a multi-episode thing. But given the class I'm teaching and that's involved in the process, I think it's worth doing. I need to think about how to do it. So if you have any thoughts about, I'm not going to probably do it. That would probably start sometime in October based on the schedule I have right now. Might hit on it in September. I just don't know if I'm going to do like 3 or 4 back-to-back episodes, because I do think it'll be at least 3 that I can see right now. Or if I'll break it up, kind of like I've done some others in the past, and do one piece, each month for a period of months. But if you have things that you want to know about in terms of the process, not necessarily, the forecast itself, but how it's getting to you. So from the very start to the very end, what's going on that leads to you getting a forecast in front of you on your screen, or that someone's providing you. So feedback that way. So there we go. So then we get to the feedback and that sort of part. If you want to get hold of me, whatisitabouttheweather@gmail.com. Or, of course, you can go to whatisitabouttheweather.com/contact. Either one of those ways work. And as always, thanks to all who are supporting the podcast. You know our method, RSVP, rate, share, validate, and pledge. In whatever way you're supporting the podcast, it's greatly appreciated. But until next time, until we meet again next week, let me just say, may you have an interesting and enjoyable weather-intertwined week, because as we all know, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.
This is 2 WIIATWEP061 production.
We're tired of hearing our uncle grovel, so please support him on patreon.com/weather.